Frank Sinatra said it the way he said everything he had already decided. A drum machine and a whisper, Michael? He wasn't looking at him when he said it. He was looking at Johnny Carson, one leg crossed over the other, the left cuff link catching the studio light the way it had caught light in every room Sinatra had ever walked into. The audience had been laughing at something 30 seconds earlier. Now they were not. They were not doing anything at all. Michael Jackson was 25 years old. He was sitting at the far end of the couch in a black military jacket, both hands flat on his knees, and he had not moved since those words reached him. Not a shift in weight, not a blink that lasted a half-second too long. The floor director standing behind camera 2 would describe that stillness 18 years later in a recorded interview, one that has never been broadcast, as the most unnerving thing he witnessed in 23 years of working live television. Not because it looked like a man absorbing a blow, because it looked like a man who had already absorbed it and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. NBC Studio One, Burbank, California. October 1983. Thriller had been out for 11 months. Billie Jean had sat at #1 for 7 weeks earlier that year. The moonwalk had happened in May on the Motown 25 special, and the culture had not finished processing it. Michael was not merely famous. He was something the existing vocabulary of fame didn't quite cover, something that was still in the process of being named. And Frank Sinatra, 67 years old, a black tuxedo, 3 decades of earned authority behind every word he chose to say, had just called the defining song of that moment a drum machine and a whisper. What nobody in the studio knew was that Sinatra had heard Billie Jean that morning, alone in a car on Mulholland Drive. He had listened to the whole thing without speaking, without reaching for the dial, without doing anything except sitting there while the song played. When it ended, he turned the radio off. Not to another station. Off. Whatever he thought in that car, he said nothing about it to the road manager who met him at the door, nothing to his arranger at lunch, nothing to anyone he ate or drank with that afternoon. He had kept it until now. The conversation had arrived at this point the way conversations on Carson's show always arrived at the interesting places, sideways without announcement, as though the destination had never been planned. Sinatra had been talking about American popular music for the better part of 10 minutes, the disappearance of the bridge in modern songwriting, the erosion of what he called real architecture, the kind of structure that held a lyric up from underneath without the listener ever noticing the scaffolding was there. Carson had guided him with 2 questions and then stopped asking, which was what Carson did when a guest was going somewhere worth following without interference. Michael had walked out at 12 past midnight. The applause was different from Sinatra's, younger, faster, carrying a current through it that Sinatra's applause had not carried. He sat at the far end of the couch and mentioned his brothers briefly and then went quiet. He was present in the way a person is present when they have stopped managing how they come across and are simply sitting in a room. The floor director, watching on the monitor behind camera 2, noted it at the time. He wrote it down later that night. Kid didn't seem to be performing anything. Carson moved the conversation toward the question of what came next for American music. Sinatra answered first. He named things he admired. Cole Porter, the way Rodgers and Hart could put a word exactly where the melody needed it without announcing what they were doing. He was warm, specific. He sounded genuinely like a man who loved music more than he loved being right about it, though anyone who had known him for more than a year understood that those 2 things were not always easy to separate. Then, still looking at Carson, not at Michael, in the way a man makes a declaration by pretending he is addressing someone else, Sinatra named Billie Jean. He said the sentiment wasn't the issue. He said he understood what the song was reaching for, the anxiety underneath it, the paranoia that made it human. He paused the way Sinatra paused, fully, deliberately, with the complete awareness that 200 people were sitting inside that silence and had no way out of it until he decided to end it. Then he said it. A drum machine and a whisper, Michael. Carson set his pen down. He did not reach for it again for the rest of the segment. The studio went quiet in the specific way a working television studio goes quiet when something unplanned happens. The equipment kept running. The lights didn't change. The ambient hum of the cameras continued exactly as it had. Only the human part of the room stopped. All 200 people, simultaneously without coordinating it, because they all understood at the same moment that something was happening that nobody had prepared for, and that any sound any one of them made would cost them the moment. Michael looked at Frank Sinatra for one breath, then a second. The floor director standing behind camera 2 started counting. He needed something to do with his hands, and reaching for the intercom felt like the wrong instinct. What Michael said next, he said quietly, not softly, there is a difference. Quietly, the way you say something when you have decided it is the only honest response left available to you. Hum me the bass line that should be there instead, Frank. Not a provocation, not theater. A direct question from a man who had looked at a verdict and decided the most truthful answer was to ask the man who delivered it to show his work. Sinatra had recorded 250 studio albums. He had performed at Carnegie Hall and the Sands and the London Palladium. He had sung for 3 American presidents. He had survived a collapse in the early 50s when the bookings dried up and the press wrote him off, and he had come back from it. He had been in front of microphones and crowds and cameras for 30 years. And in 30 years, he had never once been caught sitting in a room without an answer. He sat with Michael's question for 11 seconds. The floor director counted every one. The bass line did not come. What should have been there instead was not available to Frank Sinatra in that studio at that moment. And every person in that room felt the shape of what that meant settle over them without anyone needing to say a word. What Sinatra said after those 11 seconds, 4 words spoken without theater, without any of the performance of a man trying to recover ground he has lost, made the camera operator on camera one set his headset down on the equipment shelf and look at the floor. Those 4 words do not appear in any interview Sinatra authorized after that night. They appear in one place only. Written down by the floor director in a parking lot at 1 in the morning, on the back of a call sheet he had folded into his jacket pocket, because he was afraid that by the time he got home, he would have talked himself into believing he had misheard them. Carson called for a commercial break at 12:24. The makeup artist moved toward Sinatra's chair with a brush. He raised one hand, not unkind, not dismissive, just final. And she stopped where she stood and did not try again. He was looking at something in the middle distance. The people who had worked beside him for the longest time would have recognized the expression. He wore it when he was thinking about something that mattered to him and had decided that everything else in the room could wait. Michael leaned across the couch toward Sinatra. Camera 3 had a wide shot running. It caught the lean. It did not catch the words. The boom operator's headset was still live. He heard both men clearly. He described what was said to one colleague 2 days later. That colleague mentioned it once, in 2003, in a recorded session at the UCLA Film and Television Archive. The session is cataloged under restricted access. When the cameras came back on, Sinatra, without Carson prompting him, without any of the usual machinery of the show managing the transition, began talking about the first time a piece of music had stopped him completely. A Capitol Records recording booth, 1955. Listening to a playback of something he had just laid down. Something moved through his chest that he could not identify by name or explain by technique. He had been looking for the right word for that sensation for nearly 30 years, he said. He had not found it. He had never told that story in any interview. He did not tell it again after this one. Carson let him talk without a question. Michael sat at the far end of the couch and listened without moving. The audience, which had been bracing for something sharp since 12/9, released the air it had been holding, not all at once, not with any ceremony, the way a room releases pressure when the thing it was prepared for turns out to be something quieter and considerably harder to categorize. The segment ran 11 minutes past its scheduled end. Nobody in the production booth cut it. After the audience filed out and the studio lights came down to working level, Sinatra and Michael stood together in the corridor outside Studio 1 for 9 minutes. No producers, no cameras, one witness. What that witness wrote down in a car later that same night on a yellow legal pad he kept in the passenger seat does not match what either man's estate has allowed into any authorized account of their relationship. 6 weeks after that evening, Sinatra walked into a studio on Melrose Avenue and recorded a version of Ben. The session log lists it as personal, not commercial. 2 takes. The engineer, Dennis Ferrara, who had worked sessions with Sinatra since 1971, marked the second take complete. Ferrara would say only in one exchange with a colleague that has been documented that Sinatra sang it the way he sang when he wasn't thinking about the process, which was how he sang when something had gotten to him. The tape has not been released. In January 1984, a journalist from the Los Angeles Times sat with Sinatra for a profile about his upcoming tour. Michael's name came up in passing, a reference point, not the subject. Sinatra paused. The journalist noted the pause in his original draft. Then Sinatra said something that stayed in the handwritten notes and did not make it into the final printed piece, because the journalist could not figure out how to include it without it becoming a different article than the one he had been assigned to write. Those notes are in a private collection. Neither man spoke publicly about that October night. Not once. Not in anything authorized. The NBC broadcast tape of the episode exists and has been reviewed. What is on that tape and what the floor director wrote in the parking lot are not the same account of the same evening. Billie Jean is still playing in countries that had no commercial radio in 1983, in hospitals, in the ears of people who were not alive when Frank Sinatra called it a drum machine and a whisper in a studio in Burbank, while the man who made it sat 6 feet away and did not argue. The drum machine is still there. So is the whisper. And underneath both of them, the bass line, the one Sinatra didn't hum, the one that does something in the low register of the song that has never been fully explained by technique alone, which was always the point, and which Sinatra, sitting alone in a car on Mulholland Drive that October morning, had already understood before he walked into that building. He just hadn't been ready to say so in front of 200 people, until 11 seconds made it unnecessary to say anything at all.